James Blake is a guy who's so prolific in contemporary music that saying his name will conjure up very different meanings for different people. At first glance, he's a softly spoken singer-songwriter with a nice voice. This is how my mom sees him. I think she's vaguely a fan. At second glance, he's an avant-garde neo-soul artist whose albums are on that bleeding edge of Western pop music that flirts with experimental sounds while staying firmly in the radio playable zone. At third glance, he's an eclectic Grammy award-winning producer making tunes for Beyonce and Kendrick, as well as sneaky ones for Playboi Carti, Vince Staples, JPEG Mafia and Slow Tie, whilst maintaining a small but steady stream of his own left-field side projects that are really quite unique. But despite the considerable amount of pies James Blake has his slender organ-playing fingers in, I still get these looks of bewilderment from people when I say, James Blake is the best dubstep producer I have ever heard. And it's obvious why that comment would spin people. I say it to spin them on purpose. As diverse as James Blake's productions are, everything he's made in the last 10 years has been pretty far removed from the sound palette of modern dubstep. But believe me when I say that there was a time, before James Blake was releasing albums, before he was headlining festivals, before he became the sizable fish in the mainstream river that he is, when he was a massive fish in my very tiny UK dubstep pond.
Pull this shit up. Pull it the fuck up, come on, boy.
At the end of the 2000s, in the span of 2 short years, James Blake put out half a dozen 140 releases, many more bootlegs, and had a meteoric rise in the UK dubstep scene, shooting up from being someone whose name nobody knew to going back to back with Code 9 at DMZ, which was like the biggest dubstep night ever. James Blake's dubstep tracks were so next level that they ended up becoming associated with a completely new genre label, post-dubstep, and he ended up pushing a whole load of new styles and influences into the UK underground scene. In this vid, I'm going to passionately defend the legacy of James Blake as the hardest dubstep producer that ever lived. As the Americans would say, the GOAT. We're going to talk about the music he produced, what made it so unique, and why it still matters now, 10 years down the line. So lock in, I'll spare the horseshit and take great care, and no lack thereof, to give a man an embellished sketch of the peerless dubstep pioneer, James Blake. In the summer of 2009, I was in the habit of going to a website called Juno Music every week and browsing through all the new dubstep releases. I downloaded the ones I liked, and if there were ones I thought were sick, I'd get them on vinyl. Tune hunting had been an obsession of mine ever since I became a dubstep head around 2 years earlier. But whilst I was very much still an invested listener, by that time, the honeymoon period of my love affair with dubstep was definitely coming to an end. By this point, dubstep had pretty much become the most popular underground dance music genre in the UK, which was good in some ways, but also meant that early signs of stagnation were starting to show. Some sounds were getting massively overplayed. A staple in the weekly dubstep releases were tracks with warbling low-end bass lines, which, although often enjoyable, didn't really offer me anything that I hadn't already been listening to for the last 2 years. Listen, I love ragga vocal flips as much as the next guy, but once you've heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all released within the same 3 months, it's like, okay boys, maybe it's time for us to try something a bit different. Let's take a hiatus where we pack up the dub plates and put them in some kind of suitcase and go away with them.
Yes, I am.
However, there were even more releases of a heavier style of dubstep called tear-out music. Bro-step, the word that would eventually become synonymous with the machismo, Skrillex form of dubstep, hadn't been invented yet. But 2009 was the time when, as a UK dubstep fan, it was no longer debatable which direction the scene was heading in. We were hearing harder and harder sounds. Now, don't get me wrong, tear-out dubstep can be a lot of fun, and I actually bought quite a few of these releases. But all of these tear-out tracks are flooding the release schedule every week, so your experience of clicking through dubstep tracks was like tear-out, 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 tear-out.
You fucking cunt.
That's not to say that there weren't gems to be found during that time, but these were small needles in an ever-growing haystack. And there was loads of hay, So I was in this position where I couldn't stop looking for new dubstep tunes. You know, I didn't want to miss out on bangers, but I was definitely getting diminishing returns on my time investment. Slap bang in my time of disillusionment, there lands a new release on the Hemlock label by some completely unknown guy called James Blake. And you know, a name like that immediately stands out as weird in the dubstep scene. Our producers had names like Banger, Casper, Mala, Loafer, Rusko, all kind of playful sounding 1 or 2 syllable words. And you come across a name like James Blake and you immediately think, that just sounds like a normal person's name. What kind of psychopathic producer would name themselves their own name? But anyway, as I did with every tune I scrolled past, I listened to this guy's EP. There were a few things that were really distinctive as soon as I started listening. There's a flute sound that is smooth and clear at the front of the mix, and everything else is pushed right to the back, reverbed out. In your mind, you're thinking the flute sound is going to be the main motif, the anchor you're meant to latch onto as a listener. We also have this vocal sample. Super distinctive because it isn't a clean sounding voice from R&B or pop, but rather a throat growling harmonized melody from Negro prison blues. So named because it was a style of music created by black American inmates in the early 1900s who sang through backbreaking labor in timber yards and on rail tracks. Perhaps because of this, there's a haunting spiritual weight behind the track, even in the earliest moments, giving the listener something to pin their attention on as the hi-hats and sub-low jitter and build pace in the background. But then, the track does its first rug pull. Suddenly, everything is stripped away, and you're left with gorgeous, clean, harmonized organ chords which have this vibrato effect on them like running water. The echoey percussion is gone, the sub is gone, the flute is gone. None of those things were part of the motif, you were tricked. Everything that has happened up till this point was purely done to make the arrival of these chords more potent. And then the tune does its final rug pull. This is where the drop should be, but there's nothing here. It's just silence. And it's only 2 bars in when a snare thwacks its way into the tune to release the tension. I was floating to this beat. It was wonky as fuck. The core melodies were pulsing in and out like they were a living, breathing organism, and the dynamics of the whole mix, whether it was done by sidechaining or EQ, never stopped fluctuating, and the sub bass was going nuts. I don't think you'd be able to hear this unless you're wearing headphones or you've got a subwoofer, but the bass was doing these mad swings between low and high octaves like it's like a drill bass line, but 5 pints deep, like Louis Theroux. I wasn't quite sure what I'd just heard, but I knew it was time for me to buy this unbelievable banger. The Air and Lack Thereof EP got downloaded there and then, and the vinyl was ordered there and then. I couldn't believe how sick that tune was, and I never expected the B-side to be anywhere near as good, but Sparing the Horses is another fucking Percy. It rolls in with these saturated saw wave keys, syncopated over a galloping kick drum, and the drop is a bunch of hypercolor tendons bursting out of a box and getting shoved back in frantically again and again. Mad. Sparing the Horses was another crazy piece of dubstep production. The melodies being vacuum sucked every time they came in created a real feeling of tension and release, with each bar finding unbearable friction before plunging into the next. But aside from that, I can't state strongly enough how much this tune was also a fucking bop. The bit where the bwah bwah bass kicks in with the hi-hats trilling is hype, 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 hype. To say that I was impressed by James Blake on that day is such an understatement that I find it frankly disgusting. Here was a producer with a boring name who was a literal nobody and had never even released anything before, and he comes straight out of the gate with not just 1, but 2 of the most innovative dubstep tracks I'd ever heard in my life. If we're trying to pin down the sound on that EP, I think parallels exist, but they weren't in the dubstep scene. Months before Air and Lack Thereof came out, I'd bought albums from two LA Beats producers, When Planets Explode by Dorian Concept and Drift by No Such Thing. They made tunes with bleeding saturated saw waves, doing melodies which felt like they were bursting out of control, and that was a pretty close stylistic match to Sparing the Horses. As for the title tune, Air and Lack Thereof, 1 year previous, Flying Lotus released his landmark album Los Angeles, which had a track on it called Breathe Something Stellar Star. For me, the trembling, gliding organ harmonies and fluctuating compression on this is the closest thing we have to a prototype for Air and Lack Thereof. But James Blake had taken those LA Beats influences and turned them into something that was distinctly UK. Brooding, meditative, colourful, and genius. His EP managed to give me that spiritual feeling I had listening to Mala tracks, but he was coming at this from a completely different left field direction. The day that I discovered James Blake was a really sick day in my life. In January 2008, a year and a half before the release of Air and Lack Thereof, posts were appearing on a website called Dubstep Forum from a user called Jay Blake. This is one of the first ones ever. Safe everyone, I'm new here, but y'all seem friendly, so I was hoping you could check out a few of my tunes. I've been playing piano since ages, I'm 19 now, so it's a big influence for me, as you'll probably hear. Anyway, I recently got quite heavily into dubstep, and then production of dubstep about 5 to 6 months ago. It's all fairly dark, how intentional that is I don't know, but hopefully not too so to remove itself from the genre. Also, things I've done recently have been increasingly leery/dirty. Anyway, here's the MySpace in it. If you're a music producer watching this video, then you know this post, you recognize it, you've seen it before. I don't think there's a single music producer who hasn't written some version of this when they first started making music. You go to a forum of people who share your music taste and you pretend to ask for feedback, but we all know what you really mean is, please listen to my music because I spent all day making it and now it's just sitting there on YouTube, SoundCloud or MySpace with 0 views or listens and it's depressing. Dubstep Forum was a pretty welcoming place for new producers and everyone responding to James on this thread was pretty encouraging and complimentary about his music. In a post further down the thread he responds, this made my day, it's all great feedback, so cheers. It's nice to hear after all this time listening to this stuff day in, day out that I have a sound. James Blake became a frequent poster on Dubstep Forum after that, and the tune you're hearing beneath me right now, entitled Optimism, was one of the first tracks he ever shared with people online. Listening back to James Blake's early MySpace tunes, which you can find online in various places if you look for them, they don't really reveal anything about who James Blake would eventually become as a producer, other than the fact that he was someone who was really into OG dubstep. He made a tune called Anxiety Dreams, which sounds like something from Screamism Volume 2, and another of his tracks was called This Is The Real Blues, which sounded like Mud by Loafer. Perhaps the best James Blake Dubstep Forum moment was when he said he was looking for people to start a live dubstep brass band, and then 6 months later, this video appears on YouTube of some people doing a trumpety version of Cockney Thug with James Blake on the decks.
Now, wake the fuck up!
Can you imagine how happy it made the trumpet community when Cockney Thug came out? Finally, some representation! I wanted to highlight James Blake's history on Dubstep Forum because given how unique his eventual productions came to be, it's easy to retrospectively look at his connection with the dubstep scene as a tenuous one, to look at dubstep as just one possible subtext of his music. But the truth is, dubstep was the explicit text of James Blake's music for a very long time. It was the scene he was openly a part of and the reason he wanted to produce music in the first place. There was no way he could have known when he was uploading those first beats to MySpace that dubstep was about to undergo a massive upheaval, and the key person at the center of that upheaval would be him. When I heard Air and Lack Thereof for the first time, it was like this massive light bulb had flicked on in my head. There were so many moments of dubstep history that I'd missed through being late to the scene. I hadn't been in the clubs when they were playing Horror Show by Loafer, or when Haunted was getting dropped at DMZ, but I was surely one of the first people to hear James Blake's tunes, and it made me feel the same way I can imagine people feeling when they first heard a Bob Dylan record in the 60s, or Aphex Twin's selected ambient works in the 90s. I was overcome by a feeling of deep obligation to spread the word about James Blake's music to everybody I knew. Literally, every single person who I was casually speaking to on MSN Messenger at that time, including the girl I was trying to chirps, got an MP3 from me along with these frantic messages like, oh my god, listen to this, you gotta listen, I can't believe it. Nudge your screen, nudge, 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 nudge. I was in this loose group of dubstep fanboys who'd all go round to each other's yards for mixes, and my Air and Lack Thereof vinyl became my most valuable tool for propagandizing people into becoming James Blake fans. There was so much you could do with the crossfaders on this tune. I had loads of little tricks. I used to tease the first time the vocal came in, and then I'd tease the response section of the vocals. But the best bit to slam the crossfaders on was the oscillating sawtooth stab which went "Wah!" which I'd always play as I was mixing out. Whenever I turned up with this vinyl in my hand, I felt powerful. Everyone else was mixing these low-end wobblers and tear-out tunes, and I'd step up to the decks and suddenly start cutting through them with this incomprehensible mythical banger. There'd be like a few moments after the drop where everyone would be quiet and I'm waiting like, heh. And then next scene, everyone is like, what? Fuck off. What is that tune? Oh, this one? Oh, it's by James Blake. I don't think it's accurate to say that I was just a fan of James Blake. I was a fucking James Blake evangelist. As James Blake started releasing more tunes, it quickly became obvious that he was approaching dubstep production in a very different way to every other producer. One thing people immediately honed in on was his musicality and prominent use of chords and harmonies. While these things definitely stood out in James Blake tracks, saying a producer uses chords and harmonies is a pretty broad statement. Loads of OG dubstep producers were using them, particularly Scream and Mala, and plenty of new school producers were using them too, people like Joker, Rusty and Zombie. So it's worth being more specific about what truly distinguished James Blake's tracks from everyone else's. The thing about James Blake was that he didn't just prominently feature melodies and harmonies, but rather that he oriented his whole approach to production around them, to the extent that his drum programming, the flow of his beats, and the sound design all revolved around drawing greater attention to the stuff he was doing on synthesizers. If you listen to the Pembroke EP, one of James Blake's earliest releases which he did with Airhead, you'll hear that rather than the drum track having a constant rhythm which the melody is structured around, there's more of a turn-taking interplay going on between melody and drums. Sometimes the drums are steady rolling in a way one might expect from a dubstep track, but at other times they're being completely thinned out and interrupted, effectively bringing the whole track to a halt so that the chords can take up all the room in the mix. These were bold production choices, which honestly made the tracks way less accessible, because as a listener, you didn't have an easy beat to latch onto. It was so weird to hear this from an electronic music producer, because like, the vast majority of producers slap down a steady drum beat before they do literally anything else on a track.
I tend to always start with the drums.
Let's get a 4/4 kick drum rolling, because obviously from there we can jig it out.
I really just started with the drums or whatnot. So first I would add a clap.
In contrast to other producers, James Blake's drums weren't laid down as the foundations of his tracks, but were instead delicately molded around his melodies, stopping and starting in whichever way best served the emotional effects he wanted to create. James Blake was also oddly comfortable with leaving silence in his music, so he could have his synths kick back in with more dramatic impact. On the B-side of Pembroke, there's a track called Lock in the Lion, which has a gap that hangs for a whole bar before everything swings back in. That's a fucking cheeky move. We also hear harmonies and chords which are played once and never repeated. Case in point, this melancholy low-pitched organ section in Lock in the Lion. It plays for 3 bars, and after this, it disappears. And neither that low-pitched organ, nor the chords it's playing, are ever brought back. It was exciting listening to the twists and turns of these beats. You didn't know how they were going to unfold until you'd got all the way to the end. The first time I ever heard James Blake speak about how he made beats was on Giles Peterson's show in the middle of 2010. And during that radio appearance, James Blake played a crackly version of the track When a Man Loves a Woman by Percy Sledge. James Blake went on to explain how the copy of that record he had, which was particularly dusty and low quality, went on to influence the style of his own dubstep productions.
I rediscovered that track a while ago, and it wasn't just the song itself, but the recording of it that I had. It was quite a low quality recording of it, but it was how quiet the organ is compared to everything else. And the actual track's quite quiet, but but the organ's quite quiet compared to everything else, and it makes you listen for it. And it's got that sort of satisfyingly conventional harmony that's going on there that just, I don't know, it just hits you in the right spot. And the dynamics of the whole track just inspired a whole load of stuff for me. That organ is probably the basis for a lot of the stuff I've done, actually.
You can hear what James Blake is describing on the track Buzzard and Kestrel, where a conventional melody is being played on an organ for a lot of the tune's runtime, but it's so muted and subtle that you really have to strain your ear to properly discern the notes it's playing. The thing is that you are still constantly aware of that organ, because although it's quiet, there are no other instruments competing with it in that lower mid EQ section. And additionally, the drum samples on this tune are very dry, tight, and snappy, so they can be played at a higher volume than the organ without ever viscerally overpowering it. And James Blake has done all this to recreate what he randomly considered to be an interesting sound from a dusty 1960s soul record. This was production on a completely different level to anything I'd ever heard from anyone. There was also something far more conspicuously different about James Blake's dubstep tracks that you didn't need a trained ear to notice, and that was that the instruments he overwhelmingly favoured were soft-sounding polyphonic ones, e-pianos, organs, and keyboards. Dubstep had long veered away from these types of instruments, deliberately skewing instead towards monophonic and human noises. Like, you had tear-out dubstep with its mid-range alien bass lines. Deeper dubstep tunes had intense pulsating sub-low, which is obviously more powerful and synthetic than any bass instrument you'd hear in real life. More left-field dubstep tunes had heavy manipulated samples that were borderline unlistenable. So I can't emphasize enough how much of a paradigm shift it represented that James Blake, in contrast to all that stuff, was constantly featuring the sorts of traditional instruments you'd expect to hear on jazz and soul records. Take, for example, Love What Happened Here. It kicks in with this brassy synthesizer pad, playing a chord progression that, if anything, is super kitsch, like something that could be the outro track to an 80s buddy cop film where everyone's smiling and high-fiving each other. I think if this were the work of any other dubstep producer at that time, you'd expect these bright chords to be a red herring, like maybe there's a filthy bass line drop around the corner, but that's not what happens in this tune. James Blake does not warp the chords or fuck with the pad or manipulate the sound design in any mindfucky dubstep way. He just lets the novel chord sequence run and develop, and the amount this makes your ears lock into the harmonic twists and turns the organ is playing is mad. The chords start out sounding very proud, joyful, and sentimental, the feeling of gazing fondly at someone you love as they're doing a wedding speech. And then it veers into this tone of uncertainty, like it's asking a question it doesn't know the answer to. Then, that question is resolved, as the chords go back to a more comfortable and cozy place, before perplexed confusion sets back in, and that confusion sweeps you towards the next 32-bar sequence. I wouldn't be tuned into the chords like this if there was loads of crazy sound manipulation going on around them. So it's actually James Blake's restraint that makes this tune so immersive and absorbing. He had the ear to notice that the novel chord progression he'd created was enough to be the engine of the whole track, so he just lets it ride and develop and dominate without doing anything to divide the listener's focus. The result is a track that feels like coming home. You hear it once and you feel like you've known the melody forever. Everything we've discussed, from the way James Blake sculpted his drums around his synths to his creative embellishments and his restraint in places where it mattered, demonstrates that chords and harmonies were more than just a feature of his production. He was the sole producer in the scene who allowed his melodies and harmonies to be the foundation, the driving force, and the obsessive focus of his beat-making process. Something else that immediately stood out about James Blake's tunes was that they had a distinct texture to them. I don't mean that in the music theory sense, I mean that his music sounded like it had a wispy, textural shape to it, and that you could reach your hand out and touch it. A lot of this was down to heavy use of atmospheric effects with high-pass filters on them. Now, James Blake was far from being the first producer to use these kinds of noises. The majority of club tracks, in fact, will use a high-pass filtered sweep in the build-up to a drop. They're the noise that goes shh. So these effects very much existed before James Blake appeared, but I'd say they were underutilized in club tracks. The only people using them in more ambitious ways were people who were slightly to the left of club music. So people like Burial, who was making dubby two-step Chimera tunes, Warnatrix Point Never, who made more experimental noise music, and contemporary composers like Niels Frahm, who purposefully recorded instruments in ways which left more background noise on his records. But people who were making beats for the club tended to shy away from heavy layering of these sounds in their tracks, and there's a pretty obvious reason why. High-pass filtered noise, when it's used a lot, is a messy complication for mixdowns. It takes away focus from your mids, it muddies up your hi-hats, and it makes your tracks feel loose and less punchy. And that's an issue if you want to create powerful sounds that are prominent and clean enough to cut through on club sound systems. But James Blake was constantly finding innovative ways to use these effects in a way which complemented the creative vision of his tracks. Sparing the Horses is a stellar example of this. Part of what makes that bursting out of the box effect that this tune has so potent is that you're not just hearing synthesizer keys being played, you're also hearing this over the top of them. There's a feature on a lot of modern VSTs where you can add a noise effect over the top of your oscillator, and you can tweak and modulate it just like you would other parts of the synth. Here are some chords which are similar to the ones used on Sparing the Horses. Now listen to how they sound without the noise effect. The synth is cleaner, and you can hear the notes a lot better, but you lose that textural bursting effect. Like a lot of production decisions, it's a trade-off. Do you want clarity or novelty? On Sparing the Horses, James Blake went with novelty, and that's what ultimately made the tune so distinctive and memorable. For another example of how James Blake creates texture, listen to the track Sayin'. On the way in, we have grimy claps, atmospheric rumbles, and organ stabs that cut in and out, coming at you from bare different directions. It's a disjointed mess, pretty uncomfortable to listen to. But when James Blake brings in his signature fuzzy VST, it smooths over all that, and ties all the stabby components of the tune together in this really nice way.
We're in E1 right now, just on the road, because I'm a road guy, innit? Too late and that, this is when I come out and that, just being fuckery, innit?
Listen to that swoosh! I always thought this was such a cool track. The synth sounds like a river, and the percussion sounds like rocks being ricocheted down it. And you see what I mean when I say the atmospheric noises make the track kinda textured and three-dimensional? They form their own layer which sits on top of the instruments and the drum tracks. These noise effects are also used heavily in the track I Only Know What I Know Now, where they make the whole tune sound like it's underwater. You can hear them on James Blake's remix of Broad Factor by Lord Quaz, where the bright fuzzy synths sound like slow release hi-hats. And there's another tune which prominently features these sounds. I'm not ready to talk about that one yet, as it will spoil my video's narrative. Another thing which I feel doesn't get talked about enough, not even in the James Blake worshipping cult, which I am part of, is James Blake's use of drums and percussion. I think these tend to get overlooked because the synthesizers and chords in James Blake tunes are such a standout element. But the way the guy programmed his drums was insane and so unique to him as an artist. In the broad strokes, as producers, we all tend to get our drum samples from similar places, whether that is widely downloadable sample packs, as was the case at the end of the 2000s, or big sample libraries like Splice, which is more the case now. This means that while everyone is making different sounding beats, the actual samples they're putting in their tunes are exactly the same. And this in turn is what leads to certain samples, like my old friend the Young Chop Snare, being featured comically often in trap tunes. No one cares about this, because the unique character of a tune doesn't come from its drum samples, it comes from the arrangement as a whole, the melodies, the instrumentation, and the execution. You know what? Back when James Blake started releasing tunes at the end of the 2000s, in dubstep we had our own version of the Young Chop Snare in the form of a punchy, thwacky snare with a lot of reverb on it that sounded like this. But while dubstep drums were getting bigger and fatter, James Blake went in the complete opposite direction, making drums that were tighter and tinier. In some cases, it just sounded like he was jamming on some spoons. The character of James Blake's drum palette was mischievous and very nippy. His focus always seemed to be on constructing interesting rhythm arrangements by stringing unusual hits together, rather than making any particular drum the standout feature. James's drums were also very tuneful. He was the first producer I heard using snappy tuned 808 toms, not just as part of the percussion, but also an embellishment to the main melody of the track. blurring the lines between drum programming and melodic composition. James Blake would also often opt to use sounds that were evocative of drums rather than the actual drums themselves. On his remix of Maybes by Mount Kimby, he uses a low-pitched cowbell layered with a clap instead of a snare. And at the end of the same track, he uses smaller claps instead of a closed hi-hat. On Postpone, we have a Space Invaders blip instead of a snare. And James Blake's Snoop Dogg bootleg does away with drums completely, opting for differently pitched claps and finger snaps instead. And this is to say nothing of how inventive the arrangement of these rhythmic elements was. They have that burial-esque quality to them where they're not accurately quantized on the grid, but yet feel perfectly placed. Dubplate 4 Miles, which James Blake played during his Boiler Room set, is another great one for demonstrating the natural swing and the flow of how he could place these clapping patterns. This feels like a live Motown performance of a burial track. By virtue of his drum programming, James Blake's tunes not only had distinctive sounds, but also a unique rhythm and timbre. The final point of interest for James Blake's music, which I want to go into detail on, is the way he experimented with structure. And this was something that immediately stood out to dubstep listeners, because song structures in electronic music are so rigid across pretty much every genre, whether we're talking about dubstep, grime, garage, D&B, house, techno, whatever. The structure that 90% of producers use on every track is this. I call this the 2-drop formula, and it's quite a logical structure for dance music to follow because it makes tunes easy to mix. When you're beat matching on the intro, you don't want too many competing noises that would clash with the tune on the other deck, so the minimal drums and sparse elements help you lock the track into place. By the time you get to the drop, you've beat matched everything, so you can whip out the other track and let the crazy bass lines and rhythms fly. Then, by the interlude, you're ready to bring in your next track, so everything simmers back down again, giving you a nice empty window in which you can drop that next tune. If you miss that interlude window for mixing out because you haven't quite beat matched your next thing yet or haven't even chosen what you want to play, then you have the outro of the track, which is another big, clean, empty space, equally easy to mix out of. So there's a stone cold logic behind the sections having these characteristics and existing in the way that they do. Now, producers aren't consciously thinking of all this stuff while they're making beats. It's more the case now that this is just how tunes are supposed to be made in our minds, whatever that means. It just sounds right. If you ever watch a producer making a tune in real time, you'll see them being subconsciously compelled towards arranging their tunes in this way. The 2-drop formula, it's an instinctive choice. James Blake was making tunes in this structure when he released his first EP, but that was pretty much the only time he would follow the rules. The Bell sketch is considered by many to be James Blake's seminal work, and I'd have to agree, it is James Blake at his James Blakeiest, marrying abrasive wonky dubstep sounds with the raw human emotion and soulful vocals that would later define his career as a neo-soul artist. It's as good a place as any to start talking through how James Blake broke the mold of conventional beat structure. The intro starts off with these really unsettling layered chord sequences. You have this higher pitched foghorn synth up top playing 3 ominous chords that keep getting repeated. And then you have a subtle lower pitched organ underneath it, which feels a lot more improvisational. It plays broken chord harmonies, which can sometimes complement the main ones being played up top, but also frequently run off on their own. The audio engineering is incredibly well considered from the word go. The synths are panned slightly off center to opposite speakers, and there's a sawtooth stab effect that suddenly cuts across both of them from right to left. Very immersive. Suddenly, there's a shift when the foghorn synth and the organ synchronize to play the same chords together. This shift is emphasized by James Blake's EQ automation. It creates a feeling of forced synchronicity, like the instruments have been coerced into doing something together when it's not something that either of them really want to do, and the drop swells in like a bursting pulmonary vessel. I think the incredible thing about this tune is that it has a crowd-stopping impact when it hits with its brain feeder-esque synth designs and experimental glitchy texture, but in spite of those highly synthetic features, the tune still feels human because the R&B vocals have this grounding effect. They make it feel personal. It's like someone has banished Frank Ocean to the Shadow Realm and forced him to try and sing his way out of there. The tune goes straight from the first drop into a second drop.
No, that's quite a good song actually. No, the one that's
leading synths are replaced with a massive square wave, and James continues to drill into all the elements that made the first drop so crazy, eventually bringing the vocals back in too. Only after this do we get to what sounds like an outro. Instruments start peeling away, leaving just the drums in place, which as the listener you interpret as the track winding down to a close. But the tune has one more twist up its sleeve. Suddenly there's a new, softly strained organ, playing a chord sequence with more stages to it, striking a tone of calm reflection, in contrast to the despair of everything we've heard in the tune so far. We hear the vocals come back in. But now, against the more uplifting harmonies in the background, they don't sound tortured and trapped like they did on the drop. It's amazing how differently all the samples are coming across at this back end of the tune. This will become a recurring feature in James Blake's tunes, which I call the resolution section. Unlike a second drop, it isn't energetic, and unlike a typical club music outro, it doesn't just slowly remove instruments you heard in the drop either. It brings in brand new components and harmonies with the goal of setting a reflective tone, encouraging the listener to recontextualize the music elements they've already heard in the main tune. To give some examples of this outside of Bell's sketch, the tune Postpone is this dark percussive heater with a funky vocal refrain going. But by the end of Postpone, those vocals have been recontextualized over a beautiful, smooth organ accompaniment. Now, they're not so bright and upbeat, they're intense, yearning, and regretful. The tune Footnotes is driven by wobbly sublow blasts, which have this plinky plonky wood block swung over the top. But by the end, the track transforms into this. The woodblock motif, when placed over an organ instead of sublow hits, now sounds much more melodic and hopeful, in tune with the reverent chords. It's really clever music production. James Blake shows you a sample and then unveils it again later in a different context. In doing so, he makes you think about it in a different way. It demonstrates, in real time, that raw samples on their own are not as important as the surrounding musical context they're placed in. It's the context that defines how your brain reads them. It also fits with James Blake's approach to songwriting as a vocalist, where he finds a melody and endlessly recontextualizes it over different harmonies.
So what ended up becoming sort of my trademark, or even my biggest tool, I would find different ways to harmonize the vocal. Like a then you'd be like just trying to find something that is euphonic, and then there's so many ways of arriving and leaving.
Going back to our Bell sketch structure, we have a tumultuous intro, followed by an agonizing first drop, an even more intense second drop, deflated finally by the outro, but culminating in a resolution which is sad but calm, with introspection and a tone of acceptance. The intensity of the Bell sketch as a track is not just conveyed by the synthesizers or drums or sound design, but the structure in which the different track sections are presented to the listener. The fact the tune is front-loaded with drop sections that are never brought back makes them feel that much more biting, and the resolution section, by contrast, that much more earned and meaningful. The Bell sketch is one of the rare dubstep tunes which you need to listen to in full in order to understand. If you tune out before the resolution section, you're missing out on the journey of the tune that gives it meaning. And you can find a similar journey in so many of James Blake's tracks. Give a Man a Rod sounds like jolly elevator music in a Pokemon game, but then like halfway through, it descends into the most sinister disaster piece. It's so suffocating, like suddenly being plunged into a dark underwater tunnel. I'll Stay is a tune which stutters along jerkily, playing funk stabs, until it blends into a super smooth garage cut.
Just stay.
And I Never Learned to Share, a tune which would eventually end up on James Blake's eponymous debut album, is a really minimal piano ballad, which at the end suddenly burst into the hardest soulwave beatdown of all time. The freedom of James Blake's dubstep compositions cemented him as one of the most unpredictable creative forces in the dubstep scene. Someone who could explore extremely out there ideas in a way that made them sound coherent and considered. And his tracks shifted moods on a level that none of us had ever experienced before. All things considered, it didn't take long at all for James Blake to become a known figure in the wider dubstep community. People were having very strong reactions to his music, both positive and negative. At one point, dubstep forum users were polling the idea that James Blake might be overrated, and you can see that 11% of people thought he was fucking shit. Some important context to understand here is that this was a time of massive turbulence in the UK dubstep scene. Tear Out dubstep, which had already been kinda overplayed by 2009, had morphed into brostep and become a global, mainstream, stadium-filling phenomenon. As OG dubstep heads, we were pissed about this, because we saw brostep as a not very good version of the dubstep sound. So there was a lot of bitterness on the forums and a heightened sense of anxiety about other producers who were coming along and messing with OG dubstep tropes, which James Blake definitely was. Like me personally, I never had a single doubt about what James Blake was doing, because for a long time I'd been feeling dubstep needed a big change. It needed to take more risks, it needed to diversify, and it needed to become more melodic. And for me, James Blake was doing all those things for the sound. You didn't need to hear his tunes on a Function 1 sound system to appreciate them, and yet they really stuck with you just like those early Burial tunes did. They felt spiritual. And there were plenty of other people in the 140 community becoming ride or die James Blake fans, just like me. We thought he was a genius, and we pretty much never stopped banging on about him. But then, there were a fair amount of people who didn't get the hype. Some people found James Blake to be a bit hit and miss as an artist. For a fair amount of people, what he was making was too far away from OG dubstep, and they found him annoying rather than interesting. They felt he couldn't structure a tune properly. And a lot of people actually thought James Blake's music was pretentious, which I don't agree with, but I kind of understood where they were coming from, because he was so at odds with what OG dubstep culture was. If you think of all the original dubstep pioneers, whatever differences existed between these guys in terms of the music they made, they had very similar attitudes on the level of the culture they belonged to. They weren't chin-strokey art school students looking to challenge society's perceptions of bass music. They were sound system guys who thought drum and bass was too fast. Although they were all very invested in the movement, they had an attitude that came across as very low-key and functional. So for example, you'd never hear them waxing lyrical about what dubstep represented as an artistic concept. They'd talk about stuff like cutting dub plates for big sound systems and making bass lines.
My favourite tune of mine at the moment is a track called Filth, and it's just simply because I spent ages on the bass line and it's quite hard for people to recreate.
That way of talking and relating to the music was what we were all used to as dubstep listeners. It was the attitude we all emulated. But James Blake was like the opposite of that.
There's this article I read about how falsetto, almost like a marker of disembodiment and uncomfortability with your real self. I found that really interesting.
James Blake was highly theoretical, very, very academic in the way he spoke and in the way he produced. And although I'm sure he enjoyed hearing his tunes getting played on a fatty sound system at DMZ, I always felt he was more motivated by the notion of pushing artistic boundaries with his music than he was by sound system culture itself. His tunes showed a crazy level of awareness of dubstep tropes while simultaneously tearing them all down, and that was all done consciously by design, almost like it was an intellectual exercise for him. To a lot of people, that came off as pretentious purely by comparison with what they were used to. And so, although all of James Blake's fans were dubstep listeners, he was definitely a cultural outsider in the scene, who faced an uphill battle with a lot of people who didn't like or respect what he was doing. So, bearing all of that in mind, I saw something one day that gave me deep anxiety. News broke on the forums that James Blake had remixed the tune Roll With The Punches by Peverlist. And I think if you're a UK dubstep head, you'll already have an inkling of why this was so anxiety-inducing for me. But here's an explanation for everyone else. In the UK dubstep scene, we had a small collection of tunes which we championed as the holy grail of the sound. Roll With The Punches by Peverlist was one of these tunes. For various reasons, we as a community were really uncomfortable about the idea of people remixing these tunes. I'll be honest in saying that part of this was gatekeeping. We assigned a high cultural status to the producers on this list, and we felt that newer producers hadn't earned the right to touch these iconic sounds. However, there were some legitimate reasons too. I've always felt that although remixing is something that every electronic producer does, hardly anyone ever does it in a way that makes a meaningful contribution to the legacy of the tune they're remixing. Remixes display technical skill and creativity in the remixer's own wheelhouse, but the source material is almost an afterthought. We're not actually interested in grappling with the substance of what were the original melodies, how do we meaningfully capitalize on the soul of the source material, how can we build on or subvert the original artist's vision. And this is why remixes so often feel disposable. They're not thoughtful adaptations of the work, they're unrelated club tracks using snippets and samples as window dressing. But there's an even bigger problem in that remix culture can so often be genuinely damaging to an artist's legacy. If you're on YouTube, you already know that if you type the name of any popular song, your search results are going to get flooded by bare club remixes of that song. And I think that when tunes are endlessly replicated in this way, when you're constantly hearing remixes of the same tune in the dance, out and about, on the radio, eventually the original starts to feel cheap and disposable by association. And it's not just weird music nerds like me who think about this stuff. It's now pretty common to see people getting on the internet and pleading with EDM producers to leave certain tracks and artists alone. They don't want to see their favorite tracks get turned into repetitive remix fodder. Bearing all this in mind, when I saw James Blake had attempted to remix Roll With The Punches, I felt anxious on his behalf. James, why? Why would you put this massive target on your back when there are so many people in the scene who are literally waiting for the opportunity to criticize you? Roll With The Punches is a very special tune. It has a really distinctive hypnotic melody played on something that sounds somewhere between a piano and a flute. It has extremely tight, surgical production. The gliding square wave that comes in halfway through the track was fairly unusual for the time when it was made, as were the thwomping 808s, and both those things give the track a feel which is more evocative of mid-2010s wave music than other dubstep tracks made in 2007. And that has lent this tune a kind of timeless quality. It sounds a little bit like trap and a little bit like grime, even though it's a pre-2010 dubstep track. It's aged like a fine wine. We were extremely protective of this tune. In 2017, Drake was jogging to a trappy version of it, and he was met with exactly the negative reaction you might expect from the dubstep community. Everyone was calling him a culture vulture and saying he was trying to steal stuff from Bristol. Guys, he's turned Briss upside down, it's a 9 now. So, with the scrutinizing eyes of the dubstep heads in my rearview mirror, I eventually got the chance to hear James Blake's version of Roll With The Punches in a mix by Blawan. And I was bracing myself for the absolute worst, thinking, how is tiny dubstep newcomer James Blake expected to grapple with one of the most colossal tunes in the genre's history? But as they say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Incredible. An ethereal wash of harmonies played on mystical flutes that only James Blake could have engineered. And the reason why it was so incredible was that it felt like great efforts had been made to retain the soul of the original tune. James Blake had captured the hypnotic feel of Roll With The Punches, the off-kilter rhythms of the lead melody, the rich harmonies, but it was like he'd rebuilt everything from the ground up in his own image. This was a tune which constantly reminded you of the original, whilst creatively elevating the melodies to a whole different place. One of the things that will most stand out to producers listening to this is that the lead melodies are all built from sine waves.
What I would do is get the massive plugin, and I'd initialize the patch so it was just a saw wave, and I would make it a sine wave, and I would just play it like an organ.
This is another one of them unwritten rules of music production. Sine waves are for sub-bass. They are a single tone, they're not harmonically rich enough to be a lead synth, they sound like a fucking heart monitor, so just use them for sub-bass. That's the only thing you can use them for where they make any sense. But that was just another invisible line that James Blake casually stepped over. He layered up and oscillated his sine wave patches in the same way he would his lead saws. And on this tune, the overall effect of that is so uncanny. The track sounds out of control because of the complexity of the melodies being played and all the vibrato effects, but it also sounds mellow as fuck because of the general flatness of all the sine wave harmonics. And the drums as well were mad. I remember seeing Boofy tweet that the clicks in this tune tick with your body movement. It's so true. And the sub bass on this is a crazy wobbling tornado. Side note, there's very few people I'm aware of who appreciate James Blake's music on the level that I do, but this guy, Gaslamp Killer, is definitely one of them.
God damn, I love this shit.
What came across to me very strongly as a dubstep head listening to James Blake's remix of Roll With The Punches was that this was obviously the work of someone who had a deep personal relationship with the source material. You don't arrive at a tune like this by haphazardly sampling bits of a random track you found on Google. James Blake had meticulously reconstructed every single melody from Roll With The Punches, and he did that so he could expand on the orchestration of the original and make it his own without losing anything that made the source material so special in the first place. That amount of attention to detail and effort has to come from a place of pure love. Seeing how people in the community responded to this remix, I was just sitting at my computer laughing and saying, fucking yes, James. Everyone was gassed over this beat, and of course they were. It's like seeing your favorite movie of all time get a sequel that's somehow on a par with the original. And people were saying that it was on a par with or better than the original. That was unthinkable, coming from this insular community that was so nostalgic for dubstep's golden era. And this is our segue to talk about James Blake's remixes. I would never dream of saying that James Blake is the greatest music producer of all time. He would have to be better than Flylo, which is virtually impossible, but I do think he's the best remixer of all time. During that dubstep era, James Blake approached the task of reworking other people's tunes with greater artistic vision and insight into the source material than anyone I've ever seen before or since. The Harmonomics Changes bootleg is another one that has become iconic since James Blake first sent it to Mala in 2010. Changes is a dubstep tune so legendary that words alone feel insubstantial to describe its impact on the dubstep scene and beyond. It surfaced in dubstep's most pivotal year, 2006, which is when the scene fully disentangled itself from two-step rhythms and breakbeats and became the brooding half-step sound we've known it as ever since. Changes personifies that tipping point era in dubstep and is credited alongside Scream's Midnight Request line as being one of the first tracks that reached wider audiences, giving them a very distinctive sound to anchor to the word dubstep that was like nothing they'd ever really heard before. The standout feature of Changes is obviously its distinctive warbling vocal hook, so mythical to dubstep heads that if you play it to a room full of them, they'll passionately sing the sample like it's Wonderwall by Oasis. Even if you've never heard about this tune before, chances are you'll recognize it because it's been sampled so many times in rap music. In 2012, the tune Holy Water by The Game took the sample and put it over a rap beat. Then in 2015, the track Ralph Lauren by Wavy Jones took the sample, pitched it down, and put it over a rap beat. Then, most memorably of all, Look at Me by X heavily distorted the sample, pitched it down, and put it over a rap beat. Following that, in 2016, Young Roddy's track Water took the sample and put it over a rap beat. Then finally, in 2018, the track Svijelinista by Croatian rapper Kojo took the sample, pitched it down, and put it over a rap beat. Now obviously I'm being facetious, as my mum would say, by constantly saying rap beat. The subgenres of these tracks range from West Coast to Memphis Revival to SoundCloud rap to boom bap, but hearing how similar they all sound does give you an insight into the general lack of vision producers have for flipping the sample. Here's what all of them rap beats sound like when I play them simultaneously at the same tempo. They're all almost using the exact same beat. You can barely hear any deviations between them. People first caught wind of James Blake's Changes remix when a post appeared on Dubstep Forum saying that they'd heard him play it in the dance, and another user then posted a shitty phone recording they'd managed to take, and it set off a chain reaction of people going absolutely mental. By this point, people had heard the Roll With The Punches bootleg, they knew what James Blake was capable of, and everyone was hyped to hear what he'd done with Changes. We knew it was going to be ambitious and we knew it was going to be special. Here was a producer who wasn't just going to put the sample over a trap beat. In terms of what James Blake did with changes, it was almost like what he would have done if he was making a song for his own album. He treated the warbling choir sample as if it was a vocal, like from an R&B tune or something, and used different atmospheric layers and harmonies to recontextualize how the sample came across to the listener as the track developed. We go through a long, reverby echo chamber which has a mystical quality to it, almost definitely a homage to Mala as the godfather of deeper, spiritual sounding dubstep. But unlike all of the one-note rap bootlegs we listened to before, James Blake has another emotional layer he wants to reveal to the listener. And at the point where he reveals it after the big build-up, it is stunning. What's really lovely about this is that the changes sample on its own is one-dimensionally dark and haunting, but against these soft, non-diatonic organ harmonies, the sample is suddenly very tender and dreamlike, more like a fairy's fountain than Ganon's lair. The fact that James Blake manages to bring that to the surface without altering or pitch shifting the sample in any shape or form is mind-boggling. This section of the track actually feels like something of a reverse drop, because everything is really sweet and small. And from here, the remix goes on an epic journey as we descend into a militant brass march towards the abyss. The Changes remix is the brashest and most gutsy James Blake production in his entire back catalogue. And when you hear it live with the trumpets blasting out of the speakers, it takes you on a raw, emotional journey. And of course, I'm not going to leave this section without talking about the most revered James Blake remix of all time. The one that cemented him as my favourite producer, which was a rework of Stop What You're Doing by Untold. So what is Stop What You're Doing? I'd describe it as an extremely esoteric club track, which will be alienating to the vast majority of people. The sounds on it are incredibly jarring, so you can't relax to it, but also there's no drums, so you can't really go mad or dance to it either. If someone was to ask me to recommend them something to get them started on 140 music, this is frankly the last track I would recommend to them. Here's what we all love about it. So we have that pulse sound, which is similar to the pulse used on early 2000s grime tunes like Pulse X by Youngstar, or even more closely Stomp by Big Shot. And Untold has created the best ever version of that pulse in my opinion. It just sounds so clean and surgical. And then the mood on the track shifts when you suddenly hear these rising atmospheric pads. They sound like something off of early metalheads. And I think it's this unique meeting of the rough and the smooth that makes Stop What You're Doing such a classic. It holds your attention by force of its sheer oddity. You will never hear anything else like this. But as I said, I think the tune would fail to move people who didn't already have a cultural familiarity with things like grime and metalheads. It's just a bit too weird and out there, almost purposefully obtuse. However, something I can and do recommend people to listen to, regardless of their musical background, is the remix that James Blake made of this tune. In the timeline of James Blake's early dubs, this was the second thing we ever heard from him, and it was lightning in a bottle. It starts off glued to the scaffolding of the original tune. We hear the distinctive stilted rhythm and melody of Stop What You're Doing, but the pulses and mechanical stabs have been replaced by vacuum-sucked silences and James Blake's signature sawtooth massive synths. However, something that instantly indicates a larger shift lurking on the horizon is the emerging jostling rhythm of the kicks, claps and shakers. Rather than having the rhythm of the tune reset itself every 2 bars, James Blake starts chaining the bars together, building to a continuous flowing rhythm. By about a minute in, we are still on the train tracks of the original tune, but now we are violently juddering and shaking. James Blake's VST sounds like a magical accordion with its swirling chords, and there's this frantic sense of growing pace as the drums build and build and build. At a certain point, you get this exciting feeling that we are building up to something. We are heading somewhere. We've now exceeded the melodies of the original tune. They're far behind us, and you're bracing yourself for whatever the fuck is gonna happen next. so sick. It is gratuitously colourful, excruciatingly bright, and one of the best things I have ever heard. This is what happens when you perform an exorcism on Untold's Stop What You're Doing, and the inner ghost of that track starts flying around the room possessing everyone. The added vocal as well is just an inspired, perfect addition to the track. Bear in mind, when James Blake released this, we had no idea he could sing. We just thought he was really good at finding samples, but obviously this is him pitch shifting his own voice. It's processed enough to sound sort of off, matching the unhinged vibe of the tune, but it's also catchy as hell. Whenever I listen to this tune, I'm singing along to it without quite knowing what the words are saying. This tune is such a bold, left-field reimagining of Untold's work, and once again shows James Blake's ability to arrive at something unique, not by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but by capitalizing on the most interesting parts of what was already in the source material.
We can't really talk about that record without talking about the James Blake remix.
I sent him an early version of this, and 3 days later he comes back with a remix. And I think he said in the email, "Oh yeah, I just really like the melody, so He said, "Oh yeah, I think it was quite persistent, the melody, so yeah, I've done some bits over it." It's like, yeah, okay, James, we have to put this out now, you realise.
These remixes are love letters to the original artists, and I think they set a gold standard for what electronic music remixes can be. They don't feel disposable, they don't feel like arbitrary beats with recognizable samples tacked on for the sake of it. Each one is a portal through which you can look at the original again with a completely fresh pair of eyes. At the same time, they clearly put forward James Blake's unique artistic vision for deep, melodic, and experimental dubstep. You know, James Blake's remixes fundamentally changed my whole perception, and the perception of many others, on whether or not people should fuck with the classics of the 140 scene. If there was even a remote chance of us getting more bangers like these, then for me, it was all worth it. Now, I'm aware at this point that I've already talked about James Blake and his music to an extent that will seem psychopathic to most people, but there'll still be some people watching this who'll be wondering when I'm gonna mention Harmonomics. You see, James Blake, being the music-obsessed freak that he is, was not content with just releasing music under his own name, so he started putting out secret bootlegs on the side under the objectively better dubstep DJ name, Harmonomics. Curiously, when he was releasing under that pseudonym, most of the time, he wasn't flipping dubstep tunes or underground bangers, but rather commercial R&B and mainstream hip-hop records. And that was a game changer in the 140 scene, because in the years leading up to this, the heads had always been opposed to those kinds of music. You know, as dubstep guys, we had this notion of ourselves as authentic, dark, underground people who don't listen to anything mainstream. And whenever there were R&B vocals on dubstep beats, like in Burial's tunes or Scream's remixes, they were radically transformed to the extent that their original pop context was completely unrecognizable. But James Blake seemed to have a real affinity for R&B sounds, and he started to produce a genre that was neither R&B nor dubstep, but somewhere in between. I have a playlist of what I consider to be essential early era James Blake tunes, which if you've watched this far into the video you might want, so click. It's yours now, you're welcome. And about a third of this playlist is Harmonomics Bootlegs, which have never been released, and we only got to hear them because people were ripping them from mixes and uploading them to YouTube.
Can you pay my bills? Can you pay my telephone bills? Can you pay my automobiles?
The first one I remember hearing was the bootleg of the Destiny's Child tune Bills, 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 which was a very funky joint, but the Harmonomics bootleg that got everyone talking was the flip of Lil Wayne's tune, Amelie. Amelie by Lil Wayne, released in 2008, was the hardest rap tune of that decade, and probably one of the more enduring hip-hop releases of the last 2 decades. The beat is pure 808s and snares, and Lil Wayne snarls his way through 3 verses, there's no chorus on here. It's a tune which fully leans into the conventions of gangster rap. The lyrics are about how Lil Wayne is hard, hates shy bitches, and I think it's how dark and brazen and gangster this tune is that makes the Harmonomics bootleg feel like a punchline to a joke that the original was made to set up.
I'm millionaire,
I'm a young money million.
James Blake auto-tuned Lil Wayne's voice over the cheesiest, prancingest, baby's first piano chords ever. And in doing so, he made Lil Wayne sound less like a chest-pounding egotist and more like an emotional alcoholic. On this beat, Lil Wayne sounds devastated about the fact that he's a millionaire. sad that Young Money will never be enough, and regretful about all the dumb shit he does and his weird taste in bitches. But despite how funny it is hearing Lil Wayne like this, the tune works. The rimshot beat is hard, the colourful synths are catchy, the autotune perfectly fits with Lil Wayne's flow. It's a fucking autotune trappy jam, made at a time when autotune trap wasn't really a thing yet. And it left a massive impression on everyone who heard it because it was so odd. Like, such a unique and out there piece of music production. I have this theory that this tune started its own little baby trap subgenre, where producers started remixing hard rappers over bright synths to make them sound like they were spitting from Sesame Street. Like, after this, we got John Wayne's remix of Gucci Mane, and then there was Y2K's remix of Waka Flocka Flame, and of course, Hood Boy and Arnold's remix of Honest by Future. Okay, so I can't name that many of these, but I have a feeling more exist. If you know of any tunes that will help us expand the baby trap genre, please post them in the comments. A big part of what made the Harmonomics sound distinctive was James Blake's appetite for vocal manipulation with pitch shifting, processing, and autotune effects. Autotune was still at that stage where the only reference point people had was T-Pain, and they thought it was some pop industry trick used to make bad singers sound better. In an interview, James Blake was asked, "You tend to use a lot of autotune, even for harmonies and things. Are you worried about the stigma attached to that?" And James Blake responded, "There's no real stigma to me, it's just like any other effect to me, like chorus or delay. It's not as essential as reverb or delay, but it's something that you can just sprinkle on. In 10 years, people won't care how much pop music has been littered with it. I just wanted to use it because it's an effect." Oh, I'm James Blake and I can predict the music trends of the future. What a little know-it-all. Maybe he should predict himself a girlfriend. Oh, real talk though, James Blake had such a good ear for vocals, he could seemingly sample anything and get a memorable, singable song out of it. There's a tune called Backup Plan by Big Boy, which has this tiny snippet at the end where he's chatting.
I done had enough of the nasty stuff. 1, 2, yeah.
And the same tune has a snippet of gang vocals at the start. And just from these two sporadic clips, James Blake put together a whole abstractly soulful R&B jam. Big Boy's voice is no longer just ad-libbing. There's so much emotion that's been added through the vocal being run through autotune. Yeah man, this one feels like going to church. Every member of the church band is James Blake. The Harmonomics project also gifted us a rare grime autotune moment when James Blake crossed paths with Trim.
Look, 4 mixtapes, no creepers.
Trim is an MC who came up through Roll Deep during Grime's golden era in the UK. Now, everyone will say something different when you ask them who their favourite MC is, but whenever I was speaking to dubstep heads, Trim was always in their top 5. And I think it was because of his distinctive flow.
I didn't grow up with you, we didn't go to the same nursery, I ain't got no love for you.
He has this way of deeply exhaling all of his lyrics, sort of behind the beat in this solemn, deadpan style, which made him sound cold on all of the murky, hollowed out beats that dubstep heads like to listen to. James Blake found this random vocal skit on Trim's Soul Food Volume 2 mixtape called Confidence Boost.
Look, strike a pose. If you don't care how deep he rolls, strike a pose.
It's a random mixtape interlude, a bit like the one Kanye did on The Life of Pablo when he talks about the old Kanye. In Confidence Boost, Trim is basically encouraging people to take pride in what they do. And his message is basically, you need to believe in yourself and stay focused on your own pursuit of happiness, whatever that means to you. James Blake turned this into a pretty epic tune that takes the listener on a journey. It starts grimy and hard,
strike a pose. If you don't care how deep he rolls.
But then, a minute later, the track starts going through this transformation where it suddenly becomes really melodic, tender, and uplifting.
Strike a pose. If you don't care how deep he rolls. Strike a pose. If you know you're within your clothes.
This tune is too weird to be R&B, too soulful to be grime, too melodramatic to be dubstep. It's a Harmonomics beat, and that is a whole genre unto itself. Kind of an interesting result off the back of this tune is that Goldsmith's organ boy James Blake and Taliban Trim became like mates. They ended up shooting an official vid for the Confidence Boost track, and since then, whenever James Blake has toured the UK, Trim's often appeared on stage with him.
So, do any of you know a guy called Trim? No. Just a question, it's not.
I was in the crowd for this. I was at that year of Glasgow, and I was in a group of 7 massive Trim fans. We were all going fucking nuts. We were like, he's not gonna bring Trim on. No way, no fucking way. And then when we saw Trim pop out, we were absolutely rushing. I don't think we've ever been as hype as that in all our lives.
Listen, Glastonbury. Stack of balls. We don't care how deep he rolls.
Now, I think it's finally time for us to address the Cmyk in the room. By April 2010, James Blake had churned out 3 stylistically distinct EPs, 2 outstanding remixes, and at least 5 Harmonomics bootlegs and dub plates, earning himself a dedicated following of hardcore supporters in the dubstep/140 community. But if you were to go outside of that very niche group, no one else in the UK had any idea who he was. However, in May 2010, James Blake released a tune that instantly changed that. Cmyk is another case of James Blake taking a sample that lasts for 2 seconds and stringing it out into an epic sing-along. In this case, the sample was from the tune Caught Out There by Khalees.
Look, I found her, red coat. Look, I found her, damn, red coat. Look, I found her.
I don't think James Blake could have ever predicted the crazy staying power of this vocal chop. There's a popular meme which gets passed around on Twitter depicting the beliefs of a guy obsessed with UK electronic music in 2010. And Look, I Found Her Red Coat is the reference that gets the most response tweets from everyone. Cmyk is a tune with a really big build up and a really big drop. The build up is made of plinky plonky Rhodes piano notes, bright atmospheric noise that streams in and out, and low-ended swells of detuned synthesizers. And all of this serves to make sure that when the drop comes, it's a euphoric ride.
Look, I found her.
Equal parts vibes and emotions, Cmyk was an anomaly within James Blake's releases because it seemed like one of the rare tracks where he wasn't purposefully trying to rattle everyone's cages and pull the rug out from under us while we're trying to dance. It's got a completely regular structure, it's got a 2-step beat you can bounce to. But obviously James Blake made it, so it still sounds wonky and deep and a bit weird. Over on Dubstep Forum, we heard Cmyk a few months ahead of release because Ben UFO dropped it in a Lucky Me mixtape and Dusk and Blackdown played it on their Rinse show. And they got the usual Team James hype train going. You know, we were hooting and hollering, supporting our boy. But that summer, Cmyk did something you rarely see in underground music. It hit the intended target audience, which was us, but then it just kept going and going and going to the point where house DJs were playing it, garage DJs were playing it, indie nights were playing it. It wasn't mainstream popular, but it was like Jamie XX in 2011 popular or 100 Gex in 2019 popular. Basically the biggest you can be as an artist in an alternative scene without going full pop star. As soon as people heard that Cmyk vocal sample in a rave, they went nuts. I think for anyone that didn't know this tune, hearing it out would have been a really memorable experience because everyone around you would be losing their minds over hearing a tiny vocal sample. And if this was your first exposure to James Blake's music, as it was for many people, you had no context for anything you were hearing. The sine wavy big synth chords, the R&B vocal chops, the hyper emotionality of it all, everything we'd seen James Blake master over the course of his short esoteric discography was now randomly hitting really wide audiences, and DJs were purposefully deviating from harder bass heavy records to play this swooshy R&B infused anthem. Hearing Cmyk out was a one-of-a-kind experience. Everyone would be waving their hands in the air, hugging their mates. It was crazy.
James, earlier on I was in the car on Sunday and we had Radio 1 on, because I always listen to Radio 1. And my guess what comes on the Joe Wiley show? Your tune.
Yeah.
It sounded brilliant.
I was surprised as anyone, really. I didn't expect it to be all over Radio 1, you know. It's been amazing that people have supported it like that.
And it's here that James Blake's signature sound that so many people, including me, had always considered too weird for broad appeal, started to take on a life of its own.
What was it?
The term post-dubstep initially emerged around 2009 and was very muddy in its meaning. It was at times used to describe the people who grew up on dubstep, calling them the post-dubstep generation. Other times it was used to describe dubstepy elements like deep sub-bass being used in non-dubstep contexts. and it was also used to describe certain dubstep producers who were on the more progressive end of the sound. People like Joker, Zombie, Shackleton, and 2562, aka A Made Up Sound. I can see why in 2009 people were looking at these artists and seeing them as a step away from OG dubstep orthodoxy, but eventually the meaning of post-dubstep solidified around music that was significantly further away from dubstep as a genre entirely. Music journalist Martin Clark, aka Black Down, wrote an article for Pitchfork in May 2011 in which he highlighted the sheer breadth of producers being associated with the post-dubstep label. It included Addison Groove, who made music resembling slow footwork, Iconica, who was making blippy beats, Dark Sky, who made club rollers, Girl Unit, whose breakthrough hit What was a neon-tinged anthem in a Dirty South skeleton, and Blawan, who was making tunes that sounded like this. What do all these different styles of music have in common? Pretty much nothing. Black Down raises the possibility that the post-dubstep movement could be, in the words of Code 9, a holding pattern before the next big thing. An attempt to create some meaning around what was essentially a complete mess of different trends at a time when no unifying sound existed. What's become clearer as the years have gone by is that the biggest unifying feature of the post-dubstep movement was not actually the music, but rather the people listening to it. I was going to all the raves where these DJs were playing, and whilst each one played a slightly different style of music, whenever I looked around me, I was seeing all the boys and girls who'd been at the dubstep nights in 2009. Here's where, unfortunately, I have to retread some of the ground I covered in the last video I made about dubstep on my channel. And I say unfortunately because I said some things in that video which I think in retrospect were unnecessarily cruel to certain people in the heavy dubstep scene. In particular Flux Pavilion, UKF and Circus Records. So I'm sorry boys for being a bit of a shit, and I want to make a disclaimer before I move into the next bit of this vid. The story of the post-dubstep movement is, unfortunately, inseparable from the fact of a load of British people hating brostep at a certain time in history. I can't explain the post-dubstep movement without saying a bunch of stuff that, if you're into Skrillex and you're into the bro-steppy sort of sounds, will come off a little bit like I'm dissing you, but remember that I'm describing music at a certain point in the past. You know, both the brostep and dubstep scenes have come a long way since then and changed a lot, and obviously everything I'm about to say is based on entirely subjective opinions about music, which is an entirely subjective thing. Okay, so with that out of the way, I stopped going to dubstep nights in early 2010 because by that point, machismo brostep beats and boys taking their tops off had completely overrun the dubstep scene, to the point where no other sounds functionally existed in the dance apart from brostep. Each dubstep night was a bro down, each one more broy than the last. And in those last 6 months, I was seeing less and less friends and people I knew as one by one, they gave up on dubstep entirely. But suddenly when the new post-dubstep wave of artists emerged, even though they were making music that was completely different to dubstep, all the OG dubstep heads were suddenly reunited in this new musical space. That's why I always say that post-dubstep is a bad adjective for describing the music, but it was a good adjective for describing the people. We were post-dubstep people, guys and girls who'd been into dubstep for a long time, but now we'd moved on from it.
Dubstep is awful now. It is absolutely terrible. And I've spent the last sort of 3 years trying to disassociate myself with it.
There's a problem with the genres I've been associated with or emotionally invested in.
Because dubstep was, for me, like a very, very special thing. And then a few years later, I found myself, I was DJing to crowds where it was like, I didn't relate to them. And that's where sort of honesty left it. You have to be honest with yourself. And if something progresses away from you personally, then you have to let it go.
A research project by Robert Murray highlights that the post-dubstep movement arose not out of mutual enthusiasm for a single sound, but rather shared opposition to modern dubstep, or brostep as it was known by then. And this explains why the landscape of UK underground music so radically shifted almost overnight. If you listen to this, and compare it with this, they are two completely different styles of music, which you'd expect to appeal to two completely different types of people. And yet both of these were released on the same label, Swamp 81, just 1 year apart. By 2011, all the people who'd previously been into OG dubstep were now listening to Joy Orbison, to Night Slugs, to Hessel Audio. A massive change in people's musical palettes, which had been foregrounded by producers like James Blake, who were contorting dubstep sounds since 2009 and bringing other influences kicking and screaming into the scene. But this change was now being writ large across everyone in that UK underground world. Dubstep was completely disappearing and swiftly being replaced by other styles of music. We moved on from dubstep partly because we were embarrassed. None of us wanted to be associated with it now that it was this screamy American EDM thing. And we also moved on because there was a certain pain attached to this sound that just reminded us of what we'd lost. Almost like you'd do in a breakup, we cut off contact with the genre completely and found another scene for ourselves that was underground again, more in line with what we wanted from UK music. And that was basically what all these artists represented. What's actually really interesting is that if you look up and down Black Down's list of post-dubstep artists, you'll notice that while they're not all coming together to make a unifying sound, they are all rejecting certain sounds. Early 2010s dubstep was defined by ultra-processed monophonic mid-range bass lines, so people in the post-dubstep movement reverted to softer polyphonic melodies, R&B vocals, modular stabs, and using percussive drums as the lead. So mid-range bass lines were almost entirely wiped off the face of the UK underground scene. Early 2010s dubstep was rigidly wedded to half-step drums, so post-dubstep producers made funky house, two-step, four to the floor, and footwork mutations. In the few instances where post-dubstep producers were using half-step beats, they were hyper-stylized like James Blake's records or trappy beats or grime, so there was no chance of them even feeling like modern dubstep. Early 2010s dubstep used big reverby elements, massive kicks, massive snares, massive effects, whereas post-dubstep producers reined everything in. Super tight, snappy drums and drops that were progressive and understated. As music journalist Simon Reynolds put it in his essay about developments in the UK underground music scene, the old quote-unquote true dubstep fans have veered off in a variety of post-dubstep directions. We had no idea where we were running to, but we sure as hell knew what we were running from. So that's the academic underpinnings of the post-dubstep movement covered. But realistically, for most people, the term post-dubstep was nowhere near as deep as that. If we map out the frequency of post-dubstep as a search term over time, only two artist names appear under related topics: James Blake and Mount Kimby. 2010 was the summer of Mount Kimby's Crooks and Lovers album, and January 2011 was the release of James Blake's eponymous debut album. In terms of sheer popularity and the amount of new listeners they were reaching, James Blake and Mount Kimby kinda eclipsed everyone. And when casual listeners were landing on tunes like Cmyk and Maybes, and hearing the chopped and screwed vocals and the silky smooth style, they saw the words post-dubstep and were like, post-dubstep music, I like it. And when you ram Mount Kimby and James Blake together, suddenly you do have a very specific and cohesive post-dubstep sound. James Blake uses organic claps and tight snappy percussion, so does Mount Kimby. Mount Kimby used alien pitch-shifted vocal chops. So does James Blake. James Blake has the crazy soul wave beatdown on his Stop What You're Doing remix, and Mount Kimby have a really similar sound on Mayor. James Blake has the warm, iconic chord progression on Love What Happened Here. Mount Kimby's version of that is Carbonated. This track, so sick. Whenever I put it on, it instantly brings me back to that time when I was at uni and all my mates lived sort of close by, and we used to walk back from clubs at like 7 AM, play on the swings at Crooks Valley Park as the sun was rising. It's a very lovely tune. James Blake was actually part of Mount Kimby's live band during the year when all these tunes were getting made, so the cross-pollination of production techniques perhaps isn't that much of a surprise. That's not to say there weren't differences between the two. Mount Kimby were more indie experimental, with their audiences tending to respectfully head nod during their sets, whereas James Blake was more dubstep, with people throwing up gun fingers to Code 9.
This one dedicated to all hard man, whenever Manchester.
Yes, good boy. We now have to tell you to pull that one up.
But it was here, in the nexus between Mount Kimby and James Blake, that we saw the most defined and influential strand of post-dubstep music emerging, which would have a pretty sizable impact on the course of early 2010s club music. To all intents and purposes, James Blake and Mount Kimby were out there on their ones with their pitch-shifted R&B vocals, rich harmonic-sounding chords, and tuned percussion in 2009 through to 2010. And I think most people regarded them as art school musicians who were being experimental for experimental's sake. But as they continued to put out more and more stuff and bring R&B influences that no one asked for, by the way, into 2010's club music, it became clear there was something more to this. James Blake and Mount Kimby had landed on a very appealing style that other producers could borrow parts of for their own production. And slowly but surely we saw this niche subgenre of highly melodic and emotive club music emerging. The tune you're hearing underneath me right now is Over by Fantastic Mr. Fox from the phenomenal Evelyn EP. Before this dropped, I don't think anyone believed that James Blake's soulful left-field esotericism could be channeled into tunes that were truly danceable in that raw UK funky and garage kind of way. But the Evelyn EP came along and smashed that perception. Fantastic Mr. Fox makes beats that are incredibly unique. They sound like they've been squeezed out of a little wind-up toy box. Like James Blake, he uses detuned harmonized chords to make everything feel floaty and dreamlike, but underneath that, he also has off-kilter swung two-step rhythms driving the tracks forward. And I love the sticky little saw wave bass stabs he uses that move pretty freely about the track, running up and down to different octaves and always switching up. Fantastic Mr. Fox had the knack for wooden sounding stuff. Rim shots, bamboo sticks, oaky toms. His beats were like drumsticks on a table, and it made them punch so hard in that lower mid-range section. I used to batter the track Evelyn in all my sets, and the way it thwomped out of the speakers was always a joy to me. SoundCloud and YouTube had just appeared as music streaming platforms around this time, and one of the first people I came across when I went on SoundCloud was Kidnap Kid. I remember hearing this tune with the interlocking percussion and those choked out vocals and thinking, okay, here's a sound which is definitely inspired by James Blake, but he's moved it into a zone where I can suddenly imagine a lot of UKG heads liking it, or even people who are into house music. Basically, an audience who might have found the original James Blake stuff a bit too weird. It was a sign of things evolving. Kidnap Kid released on Squelch and Clap, which became one of the epicenters of off-kilter R&B club crossover tunes. Notably, they released the EP Refined Madness by 123 MRK, who was the person in the post-dubstep scene who went the hardest on sound design, making complex, ultra-sculpted versions of James Blake's snow-tipped synthesizers. 123 MRK was sort of like the precursor to Cmyk. They used a lot of overtly playful, almost childish sounds, but done in a really sophisticated way. Xylophones, bright kalimbas, that sort of thing. They also introduced incredibly smooth portamento vocal slides, which Cmyk specifically would go on to popularize the following year on his Mirror Maru EP. Cmyk, by the way, big Harmonomics fan. And in the end, there ended up being a load of artists in this post-James Blake garage space, with Dowd, Wana, and Bijou being just a handful of examples. This was also the start of that very specifically annoying trend in YouTube where you'd see a load of videos with pan girls in the thumbnails, and when you click on it, it's a house track. A few channels like Majestic Casual and Eaton Messy became pretty massive and helped catapult artists like Karma Kid, Bondax, and Disclosure to mainstream success. I think because of how big that house revival sound ultimately became, some of these early tunes have ended up sounding derivative purely by association, but these producers actually did something really inventive by bridging a gap between crazy James Blake productions and the kind of beats that could hook in more casual listeners. Then you had other producers who were a lot more experimental. Airhead collabed on the Pembroke EP with James Blake in 2010 and was in a similar wonky music space. His first release took that tactile, clappy, snappy feel and softened it with even more atmospheric noise and vinyl crackles, so it became a pretty fluid landscape, really nice to chill to. But then Airhead moved on to tunes like Pyramid Lake, which frankly sound like being trapped in a Harmonomics K-hole, a load of mental noises which have been time stretched and pitch bent to make one of the most anxiety-inducing records on R&S, and that's obviously saying something. To this day, Airhead is one of the core members of James Blake's live three-piece band. He's sometimes on guitar, sometimes on keys, and I like to imagine that he always has Pyramid Lake playing in his head. Yes, fucking Tekka's on the production. A producer who was, similarly to Airhead, stepping into that tactile astral plane of James Blake's early dubs was Klaus, whose warm droning organs and fleeting percussive hits sounded like they were recorded in a slow motion blizzard. It's very, very progressive music this, kind of close to what Niels Frahm might sound like if he was a post-dubstep producer. Then, diametrically opposed to Klaus, you had the incredibly bright spectral energy of Bamboo Man, who took the characteristically raw percussive elements and vocal chops you might find on James Blake bootlegs and Los Angeles'd them, throwing in saturated wobble bass lines and bleeding sawtooth arpeggios. There was even a guy combining post-dubstep sounds with Eskimo grime influences. This person's name was Becoming Real, and he was so far ahead of his time. He was the only person that I knew of in 2011, besides Zombie, who was making Esky Beat, a niche strand of UK grime characterized by square waves and glacial effects arranged in sharp, minimalist compositions. The Esky sound would go on to have a massive resurgence in the subsequent years, but at this time, when it wasn't really on anyone's radar, Becoming Real was absolutely smashing the squares. And speaking of grime, it was also from that post-James Blake era that we got the breakthrough tune Like We Used To from Bristolian newcomer Khan, who would, of course, go on to be one half of the grime and dubstep powerhouse Cmyk. Khan moved on to producing hard grime and dubstep beats pretty soon after this, so a lot of people forget about how big this particular tune was, but it was heavy. But I don't think anyone ran with the facets of the James Blake and Mount Kibi sound so competently and ingeniously as Chords. When I first heard MTI by Chords on the Giles Peterson show, I was like, here's a guy with James Blake's sensibilities for R&B who appears to be stylistically limiting themselves uniquely to tuned percussion and vocal chops. Kind of a bold move, but with beautiful results. A little bit like Burial and Missing No, Chords maintained a fixed stylistic approach throughout all of his early records, which sort of limited his range a bit as an artist, but every track sounded perfect, so you couldn't complain. There were also a lot of people in the post-dubstep era that clearly weren't making music for the club, but still sounded a lot like James Blake. I'm thinking specifically about tunes like Oh So by Evie Jane, which was experimental pop music in the vein of FKA Twigs, Average Fruit by a producer called DZA, which is a hyper-emotional ballad with classical strings and big swells on the chorus, XXYYXX, a guy who got massively popular on YouTube with a sound somewhere between James Blake and Clam's Casino, and a producer called Irfan David, who sounded so much like James Blake that they had to publish articles with pictures of him saying, "This is not James Blake." I'm still not convinced. That could be James Blake in a mask. James Blake even managed to influence a little fucking loser called Timbah, which is of course me.
You look a baby face, huh?
I released my first EP at a time when I was very into James Blake, and you could tell, right? I even look at this photo now and I think I look a bit like him, like I have a James Blake demeanor. Fun fact, the guy who took this photo was Sean Bloodworth, who also took this photo of Scream. R.I.P. Sean, lovely dude. So yeah, my style on that EP was very derivative of James Blake, but I listened back to some of the grimy crossover tunes I made, in particular Esky Hugs, which was like pingy little Esky noises with post-dubstep vocal chops over the top, and my remix of a tune by bad boy Sheffield producer Walter Rigo, which featured my favorite Sheffield MC called Raw Kid. And you know what I did at the end of this tune? I ripped off the James Blake resolution section like a music parasite. Auto-tuned the grime MC's voice, put him over some Harmonomics sounding chords. I was shameless with this shit. But I'm very fond of these tunes now. At the time, I was half listening to post-dubstep and half listening to Zombie's Esky dub plates, and I think you can hear that crossover, which is interesting, if maybe a bit unoriginal. And I feel like the artists who were clearly directly influenced by James Blake is really only half the story. Because the bigger effect of James Blake being around and being as popular as he was in the dubstep scene was a mass tipping of the scales of UK underground music towards emotionality, R&B sampling, and big chord synthesis in general. In the years after 2010, you can hear a little bit of James Blake in everyone. On Subtract's breakthrough album, for example, there was a significant presence of these big oscillating chords, which I don't think would have been there if James Blake hadn't already set a precedent for them. Same goes for Cmyk, whose rapid rise to being the favourite producer of what felt like every girl at my university in 2011 came on the heels of the UK club turn towards emotionality, which obviously James Blake laid the groundwork for. And I'd say the same thing about Jax Green. I listen to tunes like Another Girl, and I wonder if he would have pursued that direction if James Blake hadn't shown there was a taste for emotional club joints. The tune Hugs by French Fries sounds nothing like James Blake, but does use super thin claps and snaps instead of a typical housey drum track, which was something James Blake made his signature style. And there's so many tunes I hear from LA Beats guys that instantly trigger James Blake nostalgia. Lapalux's debut EP, Many Faces Out of Focus, was pretty evocative of the swooshy Harmonomics sound, but I guess way more technically refined. Crumbled Luna by John Wayne is James Blake's theme tune if he was a character in a Nintendo game. The organ chords on Camel Blues by Mindsign sound so close to the noises James Blake was getting out of sine waves on his massive synth. And Mira Massa is a producer who's really quite varied in his output, but he named James Blake as one of his most important influences. And when Mira Massa's debut mixtape dropped in 2014, you could hear a constant droning white layer of noise on the track Suicide Blades, giving it that grainy James Blake texture. The percussion on another track called Shibuya could have been clapped out by James Blake himself. It's got that same off-grid swing and live recording feel. And this is a big part of why I wanted to make this vid in the first place. Given that James Blake became super well known as a singer-songwriter fairly early on in his career, people tend to overlook the scale of this guy's legacy in electronic music. His early releases are a tiny footnote in the articles that are written about him, a passing reference to him being influenced by dubstep or dabbling in being a DJ when he was younger, but that doesn't capture James Blake as a producer, does it? He wasn't some transitory passenger on the wing of underground music. He was one of its core engines, driving the transition from dubstep into a million different subgenres of a much more emotional and colourful nature. And all of that happened because of his specific sensibilities as a producer. He took risks, over and over again, but it turned out sick every time. And I think that captured a lot of people's imaginations. We weren't inherently drawn towards R&B influences or big synthesizer chords or unusual grainy textures on club tracks. The truth is that we wanted to capture some of what James Blake had, what was initially one guy's eccentricity and bizarre experimentations in dubstep, led to a whole wave of producers making emotional bangers for years. In my other vid about dubstep, I talked about how the OG dubstep movement pushed dark, brooding beats as a response to the ostentatiousness of UK garage. James Blake was the guy who, in reaction to dubstep becoming overly dark and machismo, swung the pendulum back in the opposite direction to bring colour and emotionality back to the underground. It'll soon be time to draw this massively long video to a close, but before we finish, I want to tell you a story about what happened when I met James Blake and spoke to him. I went to see him as part of a Wigflex lineup in Nottingham in the summer of 2010, and I was just going with my girlfriend, so no pre-drinks or anything. We ended up getting there super early at 10:30 PM, and get this, the organisers put James Blake on at 10 PM. So we walked into this essentially empty room, save for two other boys who I think were just happy to see more people walk in. And there was James Blake behind the deck spinning his Cmyk EP. So obviously I was good because I missed like 30 minutes of the set, but I downed a few Jaeger bombs and enjoyed the last 15 to 20 minutes with like 3 other people in the room. And when James finished playing, I walked up to him and said, "Safe man, your tunes are really sick." And James was like, "Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm actually working on some more vocal stuff at the moment." And I was like, "Oh yeah, man, those vocal samples you use are so sick." "Oh, thank you, but no, I mean that I'm actually working on an album that's just me playing piano and singing, you know, more traditional sort of songs." And in my head, I remember thinking to myself, playing piano and singing? Traditional songs? That sounds so dumb. Not even 2 weeks later, on a Radio 1 show, Marianne Hobbs played a track by James Blake called Measurements. And it was just him singing over an organ. No wonky Harmonomics beat, no sub-low, no texture, no claps. And I realized James Blake could sing in a flawless falsetto voice. Like, properly sing. He sounded like Bon Iver. And I hadn't heard anyone else sing like that outside of Justin Vernon. On the 5th of January 2011, James Blake made one of his last ever posts on Dubstep Forum, which reads, "Hi everyone, I'd like to send a huge thank you to everyone who's supported me in the last year or so, whether that be through buying records, coming to my gigs and saying hello, or ripping new tracks off mixes and uploading them to YouTube. It means the world to me, and I'm glad Dubstep Forum is still as strong as ever. I'm doing my first headline live show at Plan B in Brixton on Friday, January 14th, and we're about to put the last tickets on sale, but I'd like to make sure people on here can get tickets if they want them." Amongst the dozens of comments from Dubstep Forum heads responding to James was this one: "Thank you. All the best in cracking the charts. You deserve to."
I think we head right to James Blake. I don't think much more needs to be said. We talk about young, we talk about dark, we talk about haunting music.
To me, his voice kind of sounds like a cross between Bon Iver and Anthony and the Johnsons.
Limit to Your Love, that was like a big breakthrough hit.
Are you worried that it may become maybe a little mainstream?
A lot of people getting excited about you talking about James Blake.
It's an odd transition to make from playing to nobody to playing to lots of people. It's quite an odd transition.
When I think of James Blake now, I am like Morgan Freeman at the end of Shawshank Redemption. Part of me is sad that he's no longer a Dubstep Forum guy in the trenches making experimental 140 beats, but I guess a larger part of me recognizes he was never really meant to stay in our world forever. He was too talented at too many things. That was always the guy's problem, to be honest. And you know, when I look across mainstream music and think about how he's become his own brand of alternative tastemaker of sorts, I can't help but feel that's some sort of net positive for society. In 2015, Rick Rubin said, "There are so many records now where it's about really heavy sub bass, maybe a hi-hat and just a voice. I think a lot of it is the James Blake influence. I feel like he's really influenced everybody a lot. I know in the artist community, everybody loves Blake. I think even the heads who weren't naturally drawn to James Blake's sound earned a grudging respect for him in the end because he proved himself to be such a scrappy and relentless innovator." This Dubstep Forum post sums it up pretty well. Now, I've had my share of anti-James Blake rants on here, but one thing I can say for sure as a producer is that he is talented beyond measure. The man is pure musician, technically and musically. I'm all for saying you don't like the sound, but leave his skills out of this. Man's got chops. Time has proven James Blake to be something of an honorary head, even in his life as a pop star. One of the first things he did after breaking into the charts in 2011 was to come back and play the foundational DMZ dubstep night, going back to back with Code 9, and he commemorated this in an Instagram post 10 years later saying, "DMZ's 6th birthday, 6th of March 2011, Brixton, Mass. This shit changed my life and I'll never forget it." In 2016, James Blake also found a way to play his Untold Stop What You're Doing remix live with his band. And he started bashing that tune out at every show. I've seen comments from people who specifically hunted down this obscure 10-year-old remix because it blew their minds hearing it live. And I like the fact that James Blake always goes to lengths to credit the OG dubstep producers and DJs who inspired him in the late 2000s.
I got into electronic music through early dubstep. People like Mahler, Koki, Loafer, Peverlist, Scream, Benga, all these artists. Code 9 was really big for me. I just absorbed the sonics of what was going on and then wanted to recreate them myself.
Nobody knows what James Blake's final legacy will look like by the time he's done on planet Earth, but we do know the legacy he's already created in post-dubstep Britain. He broke through the rigid mentality we all had towards music production. His tracks had features that made people uncomfortable. He used sounds that nobody else would go near. He structured tunes in ways that made the beats functionally unplayable, and yet people played his tunes anyway, because the execution was that good. I think James Blake's legacy in underground music is a testament to what can be achieved by producers who are willing to passionately follow their own instincts. And that's just as relevant in 2022 as it was 10 years ago. I saw a beautifully articulated YouTube comment which said that James Blake gave OG dubstep an easy rest. And I think that's such a perfect metaphor for his time making 140 beats. His tracks were an unmitigated celebration of the spirit of OG dubstep, fondly retelling its finest moments and reminding us why we loved it, whilst also pushing us on to new sounds and styles so we got the closure we needed to move on and build something new. For me, it will always be a pure joy to remember the story of how James Blake slowly earned the respect of all the heads in the dubstep scene by making the maddest experimental cuts month after month, and just when everyone was saying, okay, this guy's actually sick, he bounced to become a pop star. That's objectively hilarious. Whenever I hear the words James Blake, I will always think back to 2009, hearing Aaron Lack Thereof for the first time, discovering the Harmonomics dubs. When the dubstep scene was fading and I was feeling down, James Blake gave me a whole load of new memories to reminisce about, and I'll always owe him a debt of gratitude for that. Anyone can play chords, anyone can sample vocals, but no one will ever do it like James Blake. Maddest producer, Lord of the Harmonies, Dubstep GOAT!
Hi everyone, it's James Blake, yeah, it's James Blake. It's so nice to meet you all, well, I'm James Blake. It's so crazy, cause I can sing like this, cause I'm James Blake. Wow.
Yes, if you're still here, thanks so much for watching my vid and let me talk you through my favorite James Blake dub plates and memories. I really appreciate it. The names who are whizzing up the screen right now are my Patreon gang. I love you guys a lot. I want to offer you my humblest gratitude for throwing money my way while I make very self-indulgent videos like this one. If you're a regular Timbah video enjoyer, consider becoming one of them. Failing that, if you enjoyed the vid, smash that like and subscribe button. That's also something I would appreciate. I would love to convert more of you milquetoast bystanders into dogmatic subscribers. Few announcements to get through here, so strap in. First of all, a big thank you to man like Modell. I needed bare James Blake bootlegs for this vid as background music, but my poor brain was preoccupied with the editing process. So I shouted this guy, and he came through with the skippiest trap takes on old James Blake tunes I could have ever imagined. Modell made the Life Round Here bootleg you heard on the way into this vid, and he also made the wavy, trappy version of Cmyk you heard on the way out. If you're into heavy and colourful grime, trap, and drill instrumentals, run him up. He's always making bangers, and he's kind of a kindred spirit for me in terms of his production style. Also big up man like Parkinson White. The Roll with the Punches bootleg Modell sent over was a collab between them two. That was absolute techers, boys. Thank you both very much. Second announcement is that I have a new podcast called Jumping Off Points, which I've been doing with my mate Aiden for the past few months. We discuss issues related to politics and culture in a far more chatty way than I do in my YouTube vids, which means that we've been able to make 4 episodes in 4 months, dramatically outpacing my YouTube rhythm of 1 video every 1 year. And we specifically keep our focus on the UK. We are trying to assert some Britishness into this very Americanized space. I'll put a link in the description, and we'd love to see some of you over there if you're interested in that kind of thing. Today's Patreon question comes from Alice, who asks, in what situations do you usually listen to music? Do you find that the routine changes of pandemic life change them? I'd say yeah, massively. I'm someone who's got music on pretty much all the time because silence is like torture to me. But I never had whole days sat in my house working a job until COVID. And I found that when you're listening to music for that length of time, anything with lyrics or drums or bright leads felt too much, so I couldn't listen to any of the shit I'd normally listen to. And even classical music, you know, if they're playing arpeggios on a piano like or there's some hype string quartet going mad, it would grate on me really quickly and feel like too much. So the music I ended up listening to a lot more was very minimal contemporary classical stuff like Empty by Niels Fromm, Partners by Peter Broderick, some kind of Peace by Olafur Arnalds. These became my favorite albums to listen to. I wish YouTube had an equalizer, to be honest, because then I could chop the top end off these albums and they'd be even more chill. But yeah, that's the music I find myself most often seeking out these days because I can listen to it sort of whatever I'm doing. But yeah, thanks a lot for that question, Alice. I really enjoyed making this vid. I got into a bit of a rut recently and needed a break from political bullshit, so I was like, hey, what about more hashtag dubstep memories? I'll no doubt get back to the wacky pundits over the pond at some point, but for the next few vids on this channel, I want to keep things fun and chill like in this vid. We'll see how that goes. Thanks again so much everyone for joining me. I hope to see you all on my channel again soon, and I will say bye now.
Hey yo, white people going crazy in the